got one foot where you understand, that gives you security. And then, you know, but it's kind of dull because, hey, you know everything that's going on there. And that isn't what people are like. They don't want just security. Dostoevsky said that in Notes from the Underground, a great, great book. And, you know, he said, I love this. It was his, an early criticism of the notion of a political utopia. He said, look, if you gave people everything they wanted, they had nothing to eat but cake, and nothing to do but sit in warm pools and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. That was his lines. That the first thing they would do, well, maybe after the first week, was like go kind of half insane and smash everything up just so that something that they didn't expect would happen, so that they'd have something interesting to do. And it's so right, because, you know, the utopian notion that if you just had all the material stuff you wanted, that you'd be, well, what would you be? What would you do? Would you just sit on the couch and watch TV? I mean, you'd be, I don't know what, you'd be cutting yourself just for entertainment in no time flat, you know, and that's the sort of thing that people do. And so we're not adapted for security and utopia. We're adapted for a certain amount of security because, you know, we are vulnerable, but mostly we want to have one foot out where we don't know what the hell is going on, because that's where you're alert and alive and tense and with it. And you know, I believe this, and I believe it actually has something to do with the hemispheric structure of the physiology of your brain, is because the right hemisphere looks roughly adapted to what you don't know, and the left hemisphere, and this is an oversimplification, but a useful one, is adapted to the world that you do know, and the right place for you to be is halfway between them. Because that, and you can tell that. That's what's so cool. And this tells you that this is actually reality that's manifesting itself to you. You know, that sense of active engagement you have in the world when things are working well for you, you know, where you should be at the right time. You're alert and on top of things and engaged, and you don't have much of a sense of time, and the sense of the tragedy of life sort of recedes. And that's when you've got one foot where it's secure and one foot out in the unknown, and your brain signals to you that you're in the right place by making what you're doing meaningful. And that sense of meaning is actually a neurophysiological signal that you've got the forces of the cosmos properly balanced in your being at that moment. And that's why it feels so good. And now, well, what else could it possibly be? I mean, you know, our brain is capable of looking beyond our vision. That's what it's for. And that sense of engagement, there's no reason to assume that that's anything but a real signal. And you can reduce it. You could say, well, the problem with being where you know only is that you don't know everything. And that's going to be a problem in the future. And the problem with being where you know nothing is, that's just too much, man. Like, you know, you go into panic mode, and because anything can happen there and you can't handle it. So you got to mediate between those two things. You want to be secure enough so that your physiology isn't revving out of control, and you want to be out there in the unknown enough so that you keep updating yourself constantly, constantly, constantly. And that's the place where information flow is maximized. And you know that because that's where you are when you're having a really interesting conversation with someone, or you're gripped by a book, or you're really into a movie, or maybe something that you do as a you know, apart from your work, or maybe even in your work, you're into it. And that's because you are in the right place at the right time, and your whole nervous system is signaling that to you. And I would say that's the sort of place that you should be all the time. Of course, you can't be, because no one's perfect, but that's the recreation of paradise on earth. It's something like it, because you are in the right place at the right time when that is happening, subject to certain, what would you say, restrictions that we can talk about later. Well, that's what this guy's doing, and that's, I would say, akin to the action that God is taking when he's transforming the chaos of potential into habitable being. And it's the sort of thing that human beings are supposed to act out. And God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Well, that's an interesting thing too, because, you know, there's this play written by a German named Goethe. I can never say that properly. It's Johann van Goethe, and I can't say it, but he wrote this play called Faust, and he wrote one part of it when he was quite young, and then Faust 2 when he was quite old. And he has a character in there, Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles is the devil. And he actually has the devil explain himself twice, basically using the same words, which I really like. It was very profound. And basically, Goethe's Mephistopheles says, you know, he's the adversary of the word. That's a good way of putting it, because that's how it works out mythologically. He's the figure behind the snake in the Garden of Eden, which is something we'll talk about more. But he has a sophisticated philosophy. He's not just some random troublemaker. He's got a deep philosophy, and his philosophy is quite straightforward. And it's compelling. It's compelling. And people are gripped by it quite often, far more often than they think. And his philosophy is, well, look around at the world. It's like Ivan Karamazov in the Brothers Karamazov, when he's trying to disabuse his younger brother of being a Christian monk. Mephistopheles says, well, look at the world. I mean, you look around the world, it's nothing but a bloodbath. It's just suffering everywhere. Everything eats everything, and people die terribly, and they're cruel to one another, and the whole mess is nothing but a constant haul of terrible carnage and ruin and wreck. He says it'd be better if it was never existed at all. And that's a very, very interesting idea. And I do believe, and I've seen this in people many times, that in the depths of despair, especially when you've been betrayed, for example, and you wander into the wrong subdivision of the underworld, that's something that comes to mind. If you have a very sick child, for example, or maybe your whole family is suffering, as whole families do sometimes, an idea is going to come to you. It's like, good God, who put this mess together? And is it really worth it? Is it really worth the suffering? Suicidal people, they say no. They say, no, enough of this. And you have to be pushed a long way, generally speaking, before you'll actually commit suicide. You have to be in very, very desperate straits. But your answer under those conditions is that being is such that it would be better if it had never been. And that's I think it's a terrible philosophy, I believe, because I think what happens if you act it out is that you make the very things that led you to despair far worse. And I can't see that if it's reasonable to draw a logical conclusion that suffering justifies your desire to make being end, that the answer to that can't be to produce more suffering. That just doesn't make sense. And my observation has been that people who act out the Mephistophelian philosophy inevitably make suffering far worse. And then that raises the other specter of, well, do they want being just to cease, or are they just out for bloody revenge at any cost? And my conclusion has always been is that the mask is, well, being shouldn't exist because it's too terrible, but the true motivation is I'm going to make everyone suffer as much as I possibly can before I say goodbye to this place. And if you read the writings of people like the kids who shot up the Columbine High School, they'll tell you exactly that that's precisely and exactly what they concluded and then acted out.